the late autumn of 1892. When the borderlands were quiet and largely forgotten by the larger world, the fog came early. It settled low along the river valleys and crept inward from the high grass, dulling sound and flattening distance. Men who worked the border that year wrote of mornings when even familiar landmarks seemed altered, fence lines appearing closer than they were. Distant hills reduced to vague silhouettes. It was the kind of weather that discouraged travel and slowed patrols to a cautious pace. The location, according to surviving reports, lay along a disputed stretch of frontier between surveyed territory and land still loosely administered. Newspapers of the period referred to it only as the northern border, a region patrolled not by soldiers, but by civilian scoutsmen hired to watch crossings, track smugglers, and report unusual movements. These scouts were not advanced. Most were former ranch hands, trappers, or guides accustomed to long hours of monotony. Their journals, when they kept them at all, tended to concern supplies, weather conditions, and the reliability of horses. What survives from 1892 is consistent with that pattern in dry practical entries, written without flourish. Among them were 3 men whose names appear repeatedly in patrol notes and payroll records: Elias Monroe, aged 42, Thomas Reeve, 36, and a younger scout listed only as Calder in official documents. They rotated duties from a small outpost near the river bend, a timber structure built more for shelter than defense. Life at the post followed a steady routine. Patrols began at dawn and ended before nightfall. Meals were simple. Conversation was sparse. The fog, when it came, was treated as an inconvenience rather than a threat. Visibility could drop to a few yards, but the land itself was familiar, mapped by repeated crossings and years of use. In the first weeks of October, patrol logs mentioned nothing out of the ordinary. The fog is noted frequently heavy, persistent, slow to lift, but no incidents are recorded. Tracks along the riverbank are attributed to livestock. Distant sounds are assumed to be waterfowl or wind moving through reeds. Yet there are small details that stand out in retrospect. On October 14th, Monroe writes of a patrol shortened due to uncertainty of distance. 2 days later, Reeve notes that the fog held sound strangely, a phrase uncommon in otherwise plain writing. Calder, whose handwriting is less practiced, records only that the horses were uneasy near the water and required calming before being tethered. At the time, none of this raised concern. Fog along the border was expected. Animals reacted unpredictably to weather changes. Sound carried oddly in open country, especially near water. These explanations were sufficient, and no discussion of them appears in the records. But by the 3rd week of October, the entries grow more deliberate. Measurements are repeated. Routes are described in greater detail than necessary. Distances are counted and recounted, as though the men felt a need to reassure themselves that the land remained where it ought to be. There is no mention yet of fear, only a sense, subtle, restrained, that something about the fog was not behaving as it had before, that it lingered where it should have lifted, that it moved when the air was still, that it concealed not just the land, but the certainty the scouts depended upon to do their work. And still, patrols continued. Because in 1892, along a quiet stretch of border, uncertainty alone was not enough to stop a man from stepping back into the fog. The first incident was not recorded as an incident at all. It appears instead as a correction. On October 21st, Elias Monroe amended a patrol entry from earlier that morning. The original note stated that the men had followed the riverbank north for approximately 2 miles before turning back. Beneath it, written in darker ink, Monroe added a brief line: "Distance uncertain. Time does not agree." There is no elaboration. According to later testimony given to a regional magistrate, transcribed but never formally filed, the patrol had begun as usual. The fog was present but thinner than in previous days, enough that the river could be heard clearly even when it could not be seen. The men moved slowly, counting steps, as was common practice when visibility dropped. At some point, Reeve halted the group. He claimed they had passed a distinctive cottonwood twice. Monroe initially dismissed this. Trees along the river were similar in shape and spacing. and fog altered perception. But Calder agreed with Reeve, pointing out a scar on the trunk left. He said, by a lightning strike several years prior. Monroe later admitted he recognized it as well. They turned back, retracing their steps carefully. The river remained on their right. Their footprints were visible in the damp soil. Yet after several minutes, the same tree emerged again through the fog. Same scar, same bend in the trunk, same exposed roots along the bank. No one spoke immediately. Reeve suggested they had drifted inland without realizing it. Monroe countered that the river's sound had never shifted position. Calder said nothing, but later wrote that the air near the water felt thicker, as though movement through it required effort. The patrol ended early that day. At the outpost, the men attempted to account for the discrepancy. They examined their watches. They reviewed the route. Monroe recalculated their pace and insisted that an error in judgment, nothing more, had occurred. Fog disoriented even experienced men, and the river's curves could mislead the ear. That explanation satisfied them, at least on paper. But the following morning, Reeve refused to lead patrol. This, too, is noted without commentary. A simple line, Reeve deferred. Monroe took point. No reason given. Later that day, a second disturbance occurred, quieter and more difficult to describe. While crossing a shallow stretch near the reeds, Monroe reported hearing movement ahead of them. Not footsteps, not water. Something steady, measured, and slow. He raised a hand to halt the others and listened. By the final week of October, the fog ceased behaving as weather and began asserting itself as presence. Patrols were shortened again, though no formal order was given. The men adjusted their routes without discussion, favoring higher ground and avoiding the river's narrower bends. These changes appear only indirectly, inferred from altered timestamps and reduced mileage in the logs. On October 26th, Calder failed to return from a routine perimeter check at the expected hour. Monroe and Reeve set out to find him. Following the usual markers placed along the trail stones, stacked in threes, shallow cuts made into fence posts. These signs were intact. Nothing suggested Calder had left the path or encountered difficulty. They found him less than half a mile from the outpost. Calder was standing still in the fog, facing the river, his rifle lowered but not slung. Monroe later wrote that he appeared to be listening. When addressed, Calder did not respond immediately. Only after Reeve placed a hand on his shoulder did he turn. He reported hearing movement in the fog. Ahead again, not footsteps, but something maintaining a steady pace parallel to the riverbank. He insisted it had remained just beyond visibility, no matter how slowly he advanced. Monroe tested the claim, stepping forward alone while the others watched. Nothing emerged. The sound did not repeat. They returned to the outpost without further incident, but Calder did not resume patrol that day. His journal entry is brief and uncharacteristically careful, as though each word had been considered before being written. He notes that sound near the river now arrives before it should, and that direction cannot be trusted. 2 days later, the scouts recorded the first instance of synchronized movement within the fog. During a morning patrol, all three men halted at once, Seach later stating they had felt compelled to stop without knowing why. Monroe described it as a pause without instruction. Reeve said it felt like stepping to the edge of something unseen. At that moment, the fog ahead of them shifted. It did not disperse. It folded inward, drawing closer to the ground. Monroe estimated the movement lasted only seconds, but long enough to suggest form rather than drift. Calder wrote that it reminded him of fabric being pulled through a narrow space, who they did not pursue. Back at the outpost, tension became evident in small ways. Meals went unfinished. Conversations stopped abruptly. Reeve began marking the doorframe with chalk lines each evening, measuring the fog's reach when the lanterns were lit. Monroe questioned him once and received no answer. The horses grew increasingly difficult to manage. One refused to. The breaking point came without warning and without spectacle. On the evening of November 1st, a low wind moved in from the west enough, by all expectation, to scatter the fog that had clung to the river valley for weeks. Monroe noted the change in temperature and ordered a short dusk patrol, believing conditions had finally turned in their favor. Visibility improved almost immediately once they left the outpost. The river became visible again, its surface dull but clearly defined. The opposite bank emerged in full outline. For the first time in days, distance appeared to behave as it should. Reeve later admitted he felt relief strong enough to be mistaken for confidence. They advanced farther than they had in over a week. Then, without any shift in wind or sound, the fog returned. It did not roll in from the valley or rise from the water. It formed where there had been clear air moments before, settling in a narrow band ahead of them. Low to the ground, stretching from the riverbank to the tall grass inland, the men stopped. Monroe raised his lantern. The light reached only a short distance before dulling, as though absorbed rather than scattered. Reeve called out, announcing their presence, a practice used when encountering other patrols. No reply came. Instead, something moved within the fog. All three men described it differently in later statements, but their accounts share a common restraint. No one claimed to see a shape. No one described limbs, features, or size. What they agreed upon was motion slow, deliberate, maintaining a constant distance from them as the fog shifted around it. Calder wrote that the movement caused the fog to part briefly. Not enough to reveal what lay within, but enough to suggest displacement rather than drift. Monroe said the sound accompanied it a faint pressure against the ears, like wind felt but not heard. Reeve fired a single shot into the fog. The report echoed sharply along the river, louder than expected. The fog did not react. There was no rush, no scatter, no indication the sound had disturbed anything at all. Then the movement changed direction, not away from them, along them, parallel to the patrol line, keeping pace without closing the distance. Monroe attempted to follow it with the lantern, but the light failed to catch on anything solid. Calder later wrote that the fog ahead of the lantern seemed to bend inward, narrowing the beam. They began to retreat. As they did, the fog advanced not rapidly, not in pursuit, but with the same measured pace it had maintained before. The river's sound grew inconsistent, at times seeming to come from behind them, at others from directly beneath their feet. Reeve stumbled once and had to be pulled upright. Morning arrived quietly, as though the night before had left no mark upon the land. The fog still lay along the river, but it no longer pressed forward. It held its position at a distance, thin enough to suggest retreat, dense enough to discourage approach. Monroe noted the temperature and wind direction with unusual precision, recording details that would ordinarily have been left unmentioned. No patrol was conducted that day. Instead, the men remained near the outpost, occupying themselves with minor task-checking tack that needed no repair, counting supplies that had already been counted. Reeve disassembled and reassembled his rifle twice, despite no defects being found. Calder stopped writing altogether. When they spoke, it was only to exchange necessary information. Nothing of the previous night was referenced directly. The avoidance itself appears deliberate, as though speaking of it might invite repetition. By midday, Monroe made the decision to send a message. The note copied later into regional correspondence logs is careful and restrained. It mentions persistent fog, disorientation affecting patrol accuracy, and unidentified movement possibly related to unauthorized crossings. There is no description of the encounter itself, no mention of sound without source, or movement without form. Even so, the message concludes with a request rarely made by civilian scouts: temporary relief from active patrol until conditions improve. Reeve objected quietly. According to Calder's later account, Reeve argued that leaving the post unmanned would invite activity along the border. Monroe responded that patrols conducted under false certainty were worse than none at all. But but his entries grow increasingly formal, as though written for an audience beyond himself. That evening, the fog crept closer again, but only to the same boundary it had respected the night before. The men observed it in silence. No lanterns were raised this time. No attempts were made to test its limits. They reported no unusual conditions beyond what remains of the incident exists in fragments. There is no single report that describes what occurred along the border in the autumn of 1892. No formal inquiry was opened. No reprimands were issued, and no commendations followed. The reassignment of the scouts was recorded as routine, and the outpost itself continued to be staffed by others through the end of the year. Yet the records do not align as neatly as they should. Monroe's patrol logs, preserved in a regional archive, end abruptly in mid-November. There are no concluding remarks, no summary of conditions, no indication that the situation had resolved. The final entries remain focused on measurements, distance, time, wind-written, with a precision that suggests lingering doubt rather than closure. Reeve appears only once more in official documentation, listed as present at a different post the following spring. A fellow scout later recalled that Reeve refused the night patrols near water and requested reassignment whenever fog was forecast. No explanation was given, and none was demanded. Calder's journal did not enter the archives. Its existence is known only through references and correspondence between two clerks, one of whom noted that the journal was personal in nature and therefore not required for record. What Calder wrote after the night of November 1st, if he wrote, it all remains unknown. Newspapers from the period offer little. A brief column in a regional paper mentions unseasonable fog along the northern border, causing inconvenience to patrols and river traffic. Another notes that a stretch of river had become unpopular with local guides, though no reason is provided. Neither article connects these observations to any specific event. Oral accounts, collected decades later, are more suggestive but no more conclusive.